Thank you very much, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, the European Investment Bank, which I represent today, very much appreciates this invitation to join this dialogue and congratulates Mexico and Canagua for the work it's done to strengthen the voice of the water community in the international climate change debate and negotiations. We really recognise now how water has, may I say at last, started to move up the importance ladder in the COP negotiations. One of the most important insights that is now emerging from the current debate is the fact that it has been recognised that water is influencing so many sectors in which we at the European Investment Bank are very active. Among them energy, transport, forestry, agriculture, health, biodiversity, frankly pretty much everything. Through climate change, the investments that we support in these sectors are going to face additional risks. It's therefore very important to include water in our standard due diligence over a broad range of operations and look far beyond what is sometimes seen as a water sector box. We at the European Investment Bank are working in developed countries, emerging countries, developing markets, both in the public and private sector, which I hope puts us in a good position amongst development banks to disseminate our experiences across such a wide range of institutional and national arrangements. Through our cooperation with the EC, with the European Commission and others, we're also able in our work outside Europe to blend grants and loans in order to make these important water operations more affordable. So in Europe, integrated water resource management is seen as a key for successful projects that can make economies more climate resilient, and has been practiced for many years. In fact, in Europe, our legislation asks member states to prepare and implement water projects on a river basin level, including the transboundary collaboration between all 27 member states. For example, in Europe and in an area where we have often worked, the River Danube has 11 riparian states who are closely working together to further protect the environment of this important watercourse. Over and above this, the EU has passed legislation on floods and droughts in the face of the increased frequency of water-related national disasters, and we at the bank have already included adaptation to climate change as one of the core objectives of our water lending policy. We seek to support proactively the efforts of the member states of the Union to increase the climate resilience of their economies by mitigating the risks of floods and droughts. So I hope that the wide experience we have of working in Europe can be of benefit to the wider European debate. But I would also say that from our point of view, as an organisation that works inside Europe and outside Europe, we consider it equally as important to take what we learn from our operations outside the European Union back to our home base. I think it's very important that the feedback should be two-way or multi-way, and we all have things to learn from what's going on in operations across the world. I must say that I'm delighted that on the basis of the discussions that have been taking place in recent months, the European Investment Bank has been invited to join the Global Water and Adaptation Action Alliance as a founding member. I've already, thanks to modern communications, I've already been able to discuss this proposal with my colleagues on the Management Committee, and I'm very pleased to confirm today that the bank is delighted to accept this invitation to participate as a founder member. I would also like to break off and say that I'm very proud that our water team, represented here today, is held in such esteem by others that the water community has actively invited them. It is they, not me, who will do the real work, let's be honest, and have invited them to join these important discussions. And I hope that we are able to make an important contribution. We are looking forward to working intensely with you on this very challenging agenda. It's in the interest of the people who are increasingly affected by the impacts of climate change, which at the end of the day is going to be all of us. Thank you, Chairman, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon Brooks. Simon Upton of the OECD.
Thank you. First of all, I have to apologise for not being Angel Gurria, the Secretary-General of the OECD. I'm afraid he was unable to be here. I speak on his behalf. Secondly, the OECD has done a lot of work on water, a lot of work on climate, so we're very pleased these two agendas are being brought together. Anyone who knows anything about climate science knew from the outset that if you start playing around with the hydrological cycle on a planetary scale, you're going to cause a lot of difficulty as we move outside the parameters of our experience. So, just to register with you our appreciation of the seriousness of the problem, on our outlook, by 2030 nearly half of the world's population will be living in areas of water stress, high water stress, and that's 1 billion more than live in those situations today. So this is a major, major issue. As you'd expect from an economics-based organisation, the OECD thinks that sound economic policies are essential to making progress in this area, and that we need a broad range of policy and institutional responses on pricing, on financing, on infrastructure, and sustainable management of water resources if we're going to make progress. We know that's the case in energy, but water is much more complex and it's more fragmented. We need to move on both the supply side and the demand side. The supply side always conjures up hardware, infrastructure, and yes, we are going to need new storage capacity, we're going to need new rainwater harvesting techniques, removing invasive species from water storage. All of those sorts of things. The hardware, yes, that's going to be important, but it's time that the hard solutions were supplemented with soft ones. It's the transition, it's using the human resources and particularly the demand side that matters. And our efforts need to focus on water demand management, on participatory decision making, on the use of economic instruments, on better regulation, getting water quality standards which can facilitate reuse. We need just a much more systematic and economically literate use of the tools that are available to us, because they can be used to assist the whole adaptation challenge. Clearly, the structures that we have need to be future-proofed, and a lot of economic analysis needs to be brought to bear there. Now, I could read you the long shopping list of policy tools that the OECD's worked on for 40 years. I won't do that. The practicality of our work is actually working with governments, trying to see what works. And the people I work with are avid collectors of case studies. We've done a lot of work in Eastern Europe and Central Asia and more widely around the world. And it's often the factoids which focus on why economics is so important. I came across one the other day, a 2006 study, actually here about Mexico, which suggests that electricity subsidies to agriculture in this country, inevitably, they will artificially lower the price of pumping water. And in a water-scarce country, you have to ask whether you want to lower the price of pumping water. Now, the study suggested that if the subsidies were reduced to just a third of all electricity costs, that would result in a 19% reduction in water extraction. Now, I don't know whether that's happened already or whether it's being talked about, but it's that sort of analysis to look at the knock-on effects between sectors of the way changing prices in one area can affect the environment in another area. It's that sort of linked upness which is very important. You take another one, the agriculture-water interface. Look at biofuels. Look at the governments, the US and the EU, who went after biofuels in a big way. I wonder how many people thought about the water consequences of that. Because quite aside from the fact that subsidies for the production of crops to biofuels have all sorts of distortions for food production, you can bet they will have distortions for the amount of water that's being mined. And it's so much cheaper to do the analysis in advance and try to get out of the problem before you get into it. And getting out of it is again something that we work on. And there are some good stories here. Some of you know of the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia. It's 3 times the size of Spain and France combined. Absolutely vast, and it's had an awful history of overexploitation of water. But now, finally, that country's spending $3 billion buying people out of rights they have, moving to water trading, moving to tradable water rights and pricing of water. It's a very interesting success story. It's all about very, very careful negotiation and building structures that work. The human side of this is the hard bit. The physical side is the easy bit. But I just make the point that unless we actually do that sort of hard-edged analysis and look at the trade-offs, be transparent about them, involve all of the communities that need to be involved, we won't end up with durable human solutions. And finally, just to demonstrate the fact that it's not just a series of factoids coming from my mouth, we actually publish a lot of material. This one here, Private Sector Participation in Water Infrastructure, is a book which pulls together all of our experience on what governments need to do to interface with the people who use water, particularly in the private sector. The checklist of things you need to do to get policy coherence, because that is ultimately what this is about, as it is in so many other areas, and I hope I haven't exceeded my 5 minutes.
Thank you, Simon. Very interesting. Building up the picture. Rachel Kite, the Vice President of the International Finance Corporation. What is the IFC interested in water for, Rachel?
Thank you, Dominic. Good morning, everybody. Well, I'd like to follow on from the comments of Yolanda and others in the first session, and then from Simon in this session, and talk about the partnership between the public and private sector, and talk about how to make that work much better around the world. There are points of light. There are places where the public sector and the private sector work quite well together. Those are normally places where both sides have capacity. So talking about multinational firms and very strong municipalities or strong national governments. That is not the case everywhere, and we need to do something about that. As Simon said, the focus too much perhaps in the past has been on supply, and in order to get the private and public sector really working together, we need to shift the demand, the interest a little bit more towards the demand side, and really start looking at the nexus between demand and supply, which is basically then really talking about, from a private sector perspective, what is the planning parameter that we have for our business? What are the risks that we're assuming in our business plan going forward? What are the opportunities for better management? And also then really getting down into specific issues of supply and demand in specific water basins, in specific geographies, for the public sector to be able to regulate appropriately. So we were very interested in the last 18 months, 2 years, to work together with the World Economic Forum, with the World Bank, our colleagues down the road, but also with a number of major private sector companies, including large international banks, on what we call the Water Resources Group. And we produced a report called Charting Our Water Future. What that was trying to do was look at the gap between supply and demand in 2030. And what we analysed using this methodology was that basically the gap is 40%. So demand is growing inexorably and supply is constrained. And so that gap's getting bigger and bigger. So for the private sector and the public sector, that poses a conundrum which you can then sort of use this methodology to walk yourself through. For the private sector, this gap between supply and demand actually informs long-term investment decision-making, planning. It also informs how the private sector advocates and engages with government at the municipal, state and national level around what needs to happen in order for these water resources to be managed more appropriately by both the public and private sector. So basically, with that kind of analysis, you can start to plan business strategies in a different way. For the public sector, it provides the basis for policy choices and choices about regulatory path forward. So if you take a specific example of a country where maybe the water gap is very large and the driver of that water gap is perhaps the use in the agricultural sector, well, there are choices. There are expensive investment decisions to be made, perhaps by the public sector, perhaps with public-private partnership, to increase supply. A series of desalination plants, for example, with a price tag of billions of dollars. Or the policy choice might be to work on agricultural reform, land reform, ownership rights, etc., and agricultural practices, incentives to farmers to do different things. Now, of course, there are political economies in both sets of decisions. It may be, frankly, easier to build a bunch of desalination plants than to deal with centuries-old problems around land titling and who gets to own resources. But you begin to inform the public decision-maker about what those practical choices are politically linked to underlying analysis of what the water issues are. So, trying to break it down into the granular with shared analysis that both the public and private sector can buy into, that would allow for that dialogue to move forward and allow decisions to be made. That's why we're interested in new ways of thinking about what the supply and demand gap is. So, what does it do for us? Well, as an institution that provides advice both to government and the private sector on how to be competitive, this is a big part of our conversation with our clients, many of whom in the last 3-4 days were talking about not only driving carbon out of the supply chain, but really driving the water use out of the supply chain as well, as a basic risk mitigant for their future business strategy. But more importantly, it informs our investment decision making. If 50% of our investments over the next few years are going to be in the lowest income countries, then we need to understand how we can open up markets for smart investment, working with the public sector in water that will be fit for all. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. Building up the picture here. Now I'm delighted to welcome Luis Alberto Marino, the President of the Inter-American Development Bank. Sir.
Bueno, muy buenos días y muchas gracias. Seguramente voy a decir mucho de lo que han dicho mis antecesores, pero lo voy a decir en español. Quisiera agradecerle a Conagua, a José Luis, al Gobierno de México por esta invitación. Y claramente en nuestra región, y mirándolo desde la óptica de lo que hace el BID, el nexo entre agua y cambio climático es un tema realmente estratégico para la América Latina y el Caribe, porque el agua está mucho más íntimamente ligada al desarrollo que en cualquier otra parte del mundo. Nuestros países representan algo así como el 8% de la población mundial y controlan el 31% de los recursos de agua del planeta. Esta ventaja hídrica es evidente sin duda en la energía. América Latina genera el 66% de su electricidad con fuentes hidroeléctricas, comparado con apenas un 16% en otras partes del mundo. Y esto también es evidente en la agricultura. América Latina es el principal exportador mundial de soja, de carne, de azúcar, de café, de pollo, por solo mencionar algunos ejemplos. La producción de estos alimentos consume enormes cantidades de agua, tanto que para algunos economistas el agua se ha convertido, en forma indirecta, en una de las principales exportaciones de países como son, por ejemplo, Brasil o Argentina. Pero en años recientes hemos visto que esta riqueza hídrica puede también ser una vulnerabilidad. En los años 2008 y 2009, algunas de las peores sequías en medio siglo se causaron millones de dólares en pérdidas agrícolas y obligaron cortes de agua y electricidad en países tan diversos como Argentina, como Chile, como Venezuela, como México y como Guatemala. Este año, en Centroamérica y el Caribe, han sufrido por el otro extremo, soportando más de 19 huracanes y tormentas que le han costado la vida a centenares de personas. Para el BID, Es evidente que el cambio climático tiende a incrementar la frecuencia y la incertidumbre en torno a estos fenómenos extremos. También pensamos que el cambio climático profundizará las desigualdades de la distribución geográfica y socioeconómica del agua en nuestra región y también va a agudizar problemas como la ineficiencia en el riego, la sobreexplotación de los acuíferos y la contaminación de algunas de las fuentes de agua. Queda claro entonces que la integración entre el agua y el cambio climático representa una amenaza a la calidad de vida y a la salud de nuestros pueblos, la competitividad de nuestras industrias y por extensión el empleo y el crecimiento económico. Es por todas estas razones que en la América Latina es urgente integrar la gestión de agua con la de cambio climático y sobre todo con la adaptación al cambio climático. Este proceso de adaptación debe abarcar de manera coherente todos los usos económicos y humanos del agua, pero también la protección de los ecosistemas y de biodiversidad y las medidas de prevención y mitigación de los riesgos asociados con fenómenos meteorológicos extremos. Para lograr esta integración, creo que primero debemos cerrar la brecha que separa el conocimiento científico de una parte y la toma de decisiones en este sector. Y esto solo se puede lograr por medio de un diálogo continuo y de alto nivel entre los especialistas y las autoridades políticas en muchas de nuestras instituciones de la región. Por todo esto, el BID durante los últimos 6 meses ha venido financiando un ambicioso diálogo regional de agua y cambio climático con la participación de 23 países y de las principales entidades regionales del sector. Y en una serie de intensas reuniones de trabajo hemos producido una primera posición consensuada para nuestra región con recomendaciones concretas que hemos presentado aquí en Cancún. Y en esto pues no voy a entrar en muchos detalles, salvo concluir algunos de los principales puntos. Primero, enfatizamos la necesidad de generar información hidroclimatológica más específica y utilizable en los procesos de toma de decisiones. Y en esto es fundamental un proceso y un mayor esfuerzo de coproducción de esta información por parte de las instituciones que generan el conocimiento y aquellas que lo aplican a través de políticas públicas. Lo segundo, proponer fortalecer las instituciones encargadas de esas políticas públicas a través de herramientas de gestión integrada del recurso hídrico, como se ha hablado aquí, adaptadas para responder a los efectos del cambio climático. Tercero, también sugerimos incorporar el cambio climático en la redefinición de metas de desarrollo en áreas como, por ejemplo, la salud, la alimentación, la generación de energía, la industria, entre otros. Cuarto, consideramos vital proteger los ecosistemas, que proporcionan no solamente las fuentes de agua, sino que a la vez ofrecen resistencia natural contra los impactos del cambio climático. Quinto, proponemos una reingeniería de la infraestructura de gestión de los recursos hídricos para favorecer las actividades de adaptación. Y sexto, llamamos a actualizar nuestros programas educativos y de capacitación en el sector de los recursos hídricos a través de programas masivos de entrenamiento y la introducción del cambio climático y la adaptación como elementos claves en la formación de nuevos profesionales en el sector. Queda pues claro que hay mucho trabajo por delante, debemos definir políticas públicas adecuadas, generar datos confiables y perfeccionar herramientas para determinar los impactos futuros y la vulnerabilidad al cambio climático. Y también necesitamos establecer las reglas de participación en el proceso y crear los incentivos adecuados para su implementación exitosa. Por supuesto que el BID seguirá apoyando este proceso en las próximas etapas en este diálogo regional, pero también lo haremos con nuestros préstamos y sobre todo cooperaciones técnicas. De hecho, en los últimos 3 años hemos ayudado a financiar grandes reformas políticas en torno al cambio climático, en México, en Colombia, en Perú, y hemos invertido más de 4.000 millones de dólares en programas de gestión de infraestructura de agua y saneamiento. Como parte de nuestro reciente aumento de capital del banco, que justamente fue en una asamblea que se realizó aquí en Cancún, y esperamos que eso sea un omen para lo que viene esta semana, nosotros tenemos un mandato que debemos pasar de un 5% de nuestra actividad de crédito para temas de cambio climático y desarrollo sostenible a un 25%. Eso son algo así como 3.000 millones de dólares. Estos aportes, sin duda, junto a los de otros donantes y los gobiernos de la región, deben ayudar a financiar las líneas de acción que acabo de mencionar y que deben permitir que los acuerdos que se logren aquí en Cancún se conviertan en acciones de corto, de mediano y de largo plazo para responder a este histórico desafío. Basta mirar, entre otras cosas, estos efectos cuando uno mira en estos días lo que ha venido pasando en Colombia, en Venezuela, con las inmensas inundaciones jamás vistas, que claramente nos hablan de la inmenso vínculo que existe entre los temas de agua y los temas de cambio climático. Y por último, aprovechar y recordar que aquí hicimos una alianza con la empresa FEMSA para justamente capacitar y poder avanzar mucho más a través del TEC de Monterrey en todos los temas de elevar toda la parte institucional. Por todas estas razones, quiero agradecerles y dejarles con una idea, que hay un inmenso vínculo entre el CO2 y el H2O. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, President, for those stirring words. And so far, we're hearing about kind of how water is embedded in the economy, about the importance of these trade-offs and looking at policy, about the importance of the political economy and getting it back into this climatic agenda, the amount of money that's required and the attention and focus, particularly in this part of the world, that institutions like yours are providing. Perhaps we can take another angle on this and invite Maria Mutagamba to the podium and give us a perspective from your viewpoint, and particularly perhaps from an African viewpoint, given your various roles that you've played in your esteemed career. Maria.
Thank you very much, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really honored to be here to give an African perspective on water and climate change. Of course, I thought water was already part of climate change, and I'm really surprised that we are trying to debate whether it should be there or not, because I don't think you can separate the two. Which comes first, I don't think you can differentiate. But let's talk about it. In Africa, of course, we know that is the continent that is suffering most. And we have been telling our story over and over and over again, and we shall continue telling it. It is estimated that 25% of the population is currently water stressed. And definitely this one is going to grow to another 40% or 45% in another by 2025. We think over 400 million people will be water stressed. So water availability is one indicator of climate change in Africa. So there is no other way. That is the first hit. You may miss food, you may miss whatever, but the moment you miss water, you actually feel the pinch. And how have we felt it? We have seen rising sea levels where some of our structures on the shoreline, like Tanzania, have been washed away. But we have also experienced falling water levels. My own experience in Uganda, where Lake Victoria sea water levels went down by 2 meters. And in one day, because of high temperatures, we registered a centimeter loss of precipitation. And that was in 2006. And so alarming that I personally had to look for a technology. You know, we are talking about technology transfer. And one of the things that came to my desk was rain seeding. And I had to travel on my own money. I didn't even ask my permanent secretary to finance me. I had to go to Fargo, that is North Dakota, to look for a company that could help restore some water in our lakes. Thank God the cost was prohibitive, because they wanted $8 million, which we didn't have. But otherwise, that was a height of a tension where a country was facing stress. Our power generation had gone down, the water supplies in the pipes was not there, and everybody was on tension. And it was creating insecurity within our own region, East Africa. Tanzania was accusing Uganda, Uganda was accusing what? So that's where it starts. And that's how important it is. So I think Africa has its own story, and we want to keep telling it for everybody to understand. The impacts of climate change have been observed, as I've said, through the rising levels and the falling levels. We have also seen sea levels penetrating the fresh waters when you get the floods, and at the same time we have also seen the infrastructure being washed away. In the eastern part of the continent, lake water fluctuations have been very high, And Lake Tanganyika, Lake Victoria, and Lake Turkana have not been spared. Those of you who fly over, when you are flying from Addis Ababa to Uganda or Kenya, you will notice that Lake Turkana is almost drying up. This is an impact of climate change. In East Africa, which is likely, we are likely to experience a 5 to 10% decrease in rainfall, especially during the months of June to August by 2050. And this is going to have an impact. One, it is going to decrease the available water resources, and it is also going to decrease the food production. In 1992, Mount Kilimanjaro alone had, since 1992, Mount Kilimanjaro has had a decrease of between 50 to 80% of the ice cap there. And the remaining ice caps that are there are estimated to disappear between the year 2015, which is just 3 years away, and 2020. And what does that mean? Those ice caps, we have been enjoying the gravitational flow of water, and that has been one of the cheapest technologies that we have been harnessing. But this water is coming from the mountains. So when these ice caps disappear, we are not going to have water. That is a direct, and it is a threat of 5 to 10 years. We are having it. So definitely I don't see any climate change talk without water. On the other hand, Mount Rwenzori, the ice cap has almost declined, has actually gone down from 563 hectares to now less than 50 hectares. And we think in another 5 years, it may not be there. Groundwater is our other source of supply. Groundwater, and majority of our people in the rural areas are using boreholes. But with climate change, most of the boreholes have gone dry because the water tables have gone down. And there is nothing as frustrating as seeing a borehole constructed on borrowed money standing obsolete in the midst of a voyage. And the children are looking at it, and the women have to walk distances to get there. And I think the time for us here in Cancun to think seriously about it and find a way of integrating water in the major talks of the climate change is here in Cancun. Access to safe water, of course, is taken as a human right, but it is increasingly becoming a problem, and we think we may not be able to achieve the Millennium Goals. And when I stand here today, it reminds me history. In 2002, I remember I joined the group of people agitating to add sanitation to the Millennium Goals. Some of you were there, and they were demonstrating in the streets of Johannesburg. Today, we are now agitating to have water in the talks of climate change. So I think we still have a work to do, and I hope we are going to succeed. Of course, Africa depends on rain-fed agriculture. And as I've told you, the likelihood of having prolonged droughts is very real. In 2007, we had an experience, we had floods in my eastern part of Uganda. I went there and saw tons and tons of water flowing down to Egypt through the Nile, washing away everything that we had, food, structures, and all that. I went back in the same region in February. First I went there in July, that's when we had the storm. I went back in February the following year. I found women chewing leaves to get form of saliva in their mouth. That's how I can describe it. So that means they didn't have food because there was no harvesting, the crop had failed. And that means they didn't have water, and that is the prescription I want to bring to your picture here. That is the perspective of Africa. So I think we need as a global community to see how to factor water. For us on the continent, of course, we have been doing it. We have adapted, we have created, we have come up with our National Adaptation Plan of Action, the NAPAD, and the majority of them start with water. We want to introduce rainwater harvesting because we still get rain. But for up to now, we have been watching that water go. and then we follow it wherever it goes. At times we catch up with it, with all the data and bring it home, or we fail to get it. But we think as an adaptation measure we need to rain harvest at household level, at community level, at national level, and regional levels. That creates, we have to go to creation of reservoirs, and that should be a factor, a topic to be discussed thoroughly, globally. There was a move to stop dams, but I don't think there is any developed country that developed without the creation of dams. Are we prescribing that to Africa? I think we have to review that one, and it's right now that we have to do it. And of course, we also have afforestation. Of course, afforestation, reforestation, and conservation of the ecosystems is part of the climate change talk with the REDD+ and all that. But we ought to know that all this starts with water. Even if we wanted to afforest and we didn't have water, we would not manage. So how are we going to carry out the afforestation process in Africa if we don't encompass and consider the water issues? But we also have to look at the governance of water for both consumption and ecosystems. Right now, we have ecosystems that have been degraded and depleted. We have dry beds of rivers, once rivers. We have wetlands that were supposed to be the sponge, keeping the environment wet, that have been encroached on and have been degraded. So all that has got to come into the picture. Of course, additional related water resources are considered, and we think that integrated water resources management is something that we all need to internalize, understand, and apply. We talk about it, but when we look at the activities of various states, it doesn't capture the attention of planners. And I think we really need to get the planners and the stakeholders to understand what is integrated water resource management and how does it affect or improve our understanding of climate change and mitigation and adaptation. Of course, Africa has had its own initiative. We came up as ministers responsible for water, created the AMCAO, that is the African Ministerial Council on Water, to have common advocacy, identify issues, advocate for them, and be able to articulate them to the global community. And at the same time, peer review ourselves on what we have decided to do. How are we moving on? Synergize each other and learn from each other. I think that is a good step. It's something that came very recently, but has been successful, and we are encouraging other sectors to copy it. In conclusion, the impact of climate change will hit Africa hard. That is an established fact, through water, and extend to other sectors like energy, agriculture, human health, tourism, livestock production, and others. Implicitly, water issues therefore must be incorporated as an item in the Conference of Parties and its subsidiaries, like the subsidiary of Scientific and Technical Advice, the SEBASTA, the subsidiary body for implementation, SBI, and the Nairobi work program. And of course, all this by including water in these subsidiaries and the Conference of Parties. What are we trying to achieve? We want to set the rules of governance of water. We should have an understanding. What are the rules of governance of water, and how do they affect to improve the climate issues in our countries? We also want to look at projects of water. Do they qualify for CDM? The other time in Copenhagen, I had to come with a stove, energy-saving stove, all the way from Uganda to come and speak for it, because it is earning carbon credits. But how about somebody who is manufacturing plastic tanks to harvest water? Is that a CDM project? So we need to look at that. We also need to look at other innovative measures of conservation of water, starting from the communities. What innovation can we do at home, and what support can we give those people that are trying to do it? So when we bring all these matters, I think we have added something to our debate and our agenda. I thank you so much.
Thank you, Minister, for those very stirring words. Okay, so we have a minister you have a president, you have two vice presidents, and you have someone in charge of policy. We have a chance for one question. See, look at what he's stimulated in this panel. Minister, who do you think should answer the question? Pick the questioner. Which one? Perfect. Okay. There we are. The lucky man. Tell us who you are, sir, and one quick question.
Fred Omach from Uganda.
Very good. Sir.
Africa, the banks only lend 3% to agriculture. And this is because over 90% of arable farming in Africa is rain-fed. Recently, somebody with 300 hectares of land had it fully irrigated, and he had a 3 months crop which he was able to handle 3 times in a year. So instead of having only 300 hectares, in effect actually had now 900 hectares.
Fantastic.
Can the world be able to get appropriate and affordable irrigation equipment for the world so that there will be no food to at least 25%, and we shall all be home and dry?
Thank you. Thank you. So, will we be able to get the agricultural and irrigation technology to those who need it? A quick sweep around the panel. Rachel?
So I think that the technology exists, and if you look to India, where you see Jain irrigation and people like that with drop for crop technology, which is allowing for an efficiency of use of water, which is extraordinary. The question is how to promote the South-South promotion of these kinds of technologies, and how then to finance them. But this is going to come from the private sector. So I think that the question for African governments is the investment climate. The job for the multilateral development banks on the public side is to invest in the investment climate of these countries and to allow for government regulation that would promote that kind of activity from the private sector. And then the good news is that the technology exists, but it's not about a north-south transfer of technology. This is technology that's going to come from India, from China, etc., into Africa, and we have to do more. I completely agree. The good news is that we don't have to. It's not rocket science at this point.
Thank you very much.
I think for purposes of interest, I think I will skip that question. I will answer the next one.
Very good. Very good. Very good.
Look, I think one of the most untold story of Latin America is how technology has allowed for a huge growth in productivity in agriculture. And it's largely been driven by the private sector. Yes, there is still a huge space for multilateral institutions like ourselves to continue to support, the whole logistics system, the irrigation systems that need to be financed to allow for increased productivity, and certainly for storage capacity and ports. But the reality is that what we have seen in Latin America, and that's why, with very little increase in the use of arable land, we have seen a multiplicity of increase in the production of food. And that is a technological revolution of itself that few times is told about.
Thank you very much. If my final two panelists, if you'll forgive me, then I want to give time for our host to wrap up. So that was interesting, very interesting. Well, we've come through this debate. We're hearing about the scale and size of the problem and the interconnected nature of this problem: food, energy, water, climate. We're hearing about the need for analysis, for good quality information to underpin the decision-making we're going to need. We're hearing for institutional reform and coalitions between the public and private and expert organizations for this transformation agenda that's required, and for this agenda to be integrally part of both the climate agenda and possibly other energy discussions and trade discussions. Water runs through our global economy. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. I'm going to hand us back to our host now, who I'm sure has made copious notes from the discussions. Juan Luis Leche Tamago, the Director General of Camagua. Thank you very much for giving us the chance for this discussion and for hosting all of these dialogues. I congratulate you on behalf of the audience for really pushing this agenda. Sir, your final words.
Muchísimas gracias. Unas brevísimas palabras para concluir, porque realmente ha sido riquísimo este panel de alto nivel. Yo en lo personal me siento muy satisfecho por los resultados de este esfuerzo de la Comisión Nacional del Agua, de mis colegas, pero también de todas las instituciones asociadas, que hicimos realmente un gran esfuerzo por estar aquí, por estar presentes, por tener estos diálogos por el agua como una reunión asociada de muy alto nivel en la conferencia de las partes en la COP16. Yo quisiera simplemente decirles que en varias de las reuniones que tuvimos en la región latinoamericana, por ejemplo, en la 11ª conferencia de directores iberoamericanos del agua, o en las reuniones organizadas por el Centro del Agua para América Latina y el Caribe, coincidíamos en qué importantes y qué impactantes van a ser los efectos del cambio climático en nuestra región. Por ejemplo, graficamos en los últimos 30 años los huracanes de mayor intensidad, categoría 3 a 5. Y la curva es así, es una curva con pendiente positiva, ascendente, impresionante. Y todos coincidíamos en los enormes daños y pérdidas de vidas en que está incurriendo en toda la región centroamericana y del Caribe, México y Estados Unidos. También se analizó mucho los patrones de lluvias, cómo afectan a nuestros cultivos, la agricultura, el sector agropecuario. Yo, por ejemplo, llevé el caso de la Ciudad de México, que ustedes conocen muy bien, la tercera metrópoli ya en el mundo con más de 20 millones de habitantes, y cómo tuvimos, por ejemplo, en el 2009, una de las fuentes más importantes de abastecimiento, que es un sistema que se llama Cutzamala, con un conjunto de presas entre el estado de Michoacán y el estado de México, pues tuvimos que racionar el agua, no tuvimos lluvia en el 2009. Este año, en el 2010, en febrero, cuando nunca nos llueve en febrero, es realmente el periodo de estiaje, tuvimos lluvias extraordinarias que causaron muchísimos daños en todo el país, pero particularmente en la Ciudad de México. Claro, las presas de este sistema Cutzamala en 2-3 días se llenaron, o sea, fue impresionante, por un lado los daños y por otro lado los beneficios que tuvimos. Y de aquí, bueno, vimos la necesidad, todos los responsables del agua de los países que hemos participado en la conferencia iberoamericana, de incorporar el tema de adaptación a nuestros programas hídricos. Y en México, desde la administración anterior, pero en esta administración del presidente Felipe Calderón, que está aquí ahorita en el Moon Palace presidiendo esta importantísima reunión de la COP16, incorporamos el tema de adaptación. Pero vimos la necesidad incluso de meternos a una visión de más largo plazo, no solamente la administración política administrativa de 6 años de una presidencia, sino que dimos una proyección a 20 años en un programa que le llamamos Agenda del Agua 2030. Y le pusimos números y proyectos y nos pusimos como objetivo tratar todas las aguas residuales, limpiar todos los ríos del país, equilibrar nuestros acuíferos, reordenar el territorio, que es uno de los problemas más graves en Centro y Latinoamérica, que parece que cojeamos del mismo pie. Los asentamientos humanos no tienen orden, hay crecimientos anárquicos, asentamientos en zonas de muy alto riesgo, en los cauces de los ríos, en zonas inundables, en las barrancas, en fin. Esos programas también transversalmente recuperar nuestros bosques y nuestras selvas, que es tan importante en toda la región. Y en el caso de México, le pusimos, incluso ya lo afinamos el lápiz y requerimos invertir $100 billones en los próximos 20 años. Y sabemos que hay el recurso, y aquí con el apoyo de Luis Alberto no vamos a tener problema, ¿verdad?, para financiar las obras que se requieren precisamente en materia de adaptación. Y al venir aquí y reunirnos con algunos colegas de los negociadores de alto nivel, pues como que percibimos cierto nerviosismo, como que decían, bueno, ustedes, ¿cómo quieren ahorita meter este tema del agua? No lo queremos meter ahorita, lo queremos meter desde hacía muchísimos años atrás, porque estamos convencidos que el tema de adaptación es parte fundamental en la discusión de reducción de emisiones, porque los responsables del agua sabemos que los costos son mayores, y esto, claro, realmente genera un problema en estas discusiones. Hay mucho debate. Yo, en lo personal, en México, sé que la adaptación nos va a costar mucho más que que lo que tenemos que invertir para reducir las emisiones. Yo estoy convencido de ello. Pero estamos aquí realmente para apoyar los acuerdos en la COP16. No es otro nuestro objetivo, y quiero aclararlo, porque realmente algunos de los negociadores sinceramente se sintieron incómodos. No venimos a pedir más recursos, venimos a apoyar las conclusiones y que haya acuerdos en esta COP16. Tiene que haber acuerdos en este momento, porque si no la adaptación el próximo año nos va a costar el doble. Y esa es la razón por la que realmente hicimos estos diálogos por el agua, y yo quiero agradecer a nombre de todos los participantes la acogida que tuvimos en esta COP16, que nos hayan abierto las puertas. Estoy convencido que vamos a incorporar en las discusiones y en los textos el tema de la adaptación. Muchísimas gracias a todos los panelistas. Muchas gracias.